In the darkness of occupied Europe, in the shadowed streets of cities under Nazi control, a different kind of war was being fought. This was not the war of massed armies and thundering artillery, but a war of shadows and whispers, of sabotage and assassination, where victory often depended not on firepower, but on absolute silence. In this secret war, British agents and resistance fighters needed weapons that could kill without sound, that could eliminate a target and allow the assassin to vanish into the night before anyone knew a shot had been fired. Conventional firearms, even with makeshift silencers, were far too loud for such operations. What was needed was something entirely new, a weapon engineered from the ground up to be virtually silent, a tool designed specifically for killing in complete stealth. The answer came from a secret British weapons development facility, and it would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War. It looked like a section of metal pipe with a grip. It fired only one shot before requiring manual reloading. It was crude in appearance but sophisticated in design, and in the hands of trained operatives it was one of the most effective assassination weapons ever created. This was the Welrod, and this is the story of the silent killer that helped turn the tide of the secret war. The need for a truly silent weapon emerged from the nature of clandestine warfare in occupied territory. By 1941 and 42, the Special Operations Executive, Britain's organisation dedicated to sabotage and subversion behind enemy lines, was operating across Nazi-controlled Europe. SOE agents, working with local resistance movements, conducted operations ranging from industrial sabotage to the assassination of collaborators and occupation officials, but every operation carried enormous risks. Occupied Europe was a police state, with Nazi security forces, the Gestapo, and collaborationist police maintaining constant surveillance and brutal repression. Any noise, any disturbance that attracted attention could result in the capture, torture, and execution of agents and their resistance contacts. A single gunshot in the night could bring German soldiers running, could trigger house-to-house searches, could expose entire resistance networks. SOE desperately needed a way to eliminate targets silently, allowing agents to strike and escape undetected. Existing weapons were inadequate for these requirements. Standard military pistols, even when fitted with improvised silencers, remained far too loud. The crack of a bullet breaking the sound barrier, the mechanical noise of the weapon's action cycling, and the report of escaping gases all contributed to a signature that could be heard at considerable distances. Commercial silencers of the era, mostly American designs intended for sport shooting, reduced noise somewhat but were bulky, unreliable, and still produced sounds clearly identifiable as gunfire. What SOE needed was fundamentally different. Not merely a suppressed weapon, but one engineered from the beginning to be as close to truly silent as physics and engineering would allow. The weapon would need to be simple enough to manufacture and maintain under clandestine conditions, reliable despite limited maintenance, small enough to conceal easily, and above all, quiet enough that an assassination could take place in an occupied city without alerting nearby German patrols. The development of this weapon fell to Station 9, a secret facility located at the Fraythe, a country house in Hertfordshire converted into a clandestine weapons research laboratory. Station 9 was one of several secret installations where British engineers and scientists worked on specialised equipment for clandestine operations, explosive devices disguised as everyday objects, radio equipment for agents, and weapons for silent killing. The team included civilian engineers, military specialists, and creative thinkers willing to approach weapons design from entirely unconventional angles. Among them was Major Hugh Reeves, an engineer who understood acoustics and ballistics, and who would become the primary designer of what would be designated the Welrod, a name that apparently combined well, possibly from Welwyn where some testing occurred, and rod, describing its distinctive appearance. The Welrod that emerged from Station 9 was unlike any firearm previously created. It was a single-shot weapon, operated by a bolt-action mechanism, chambered for the subsonic 32 ACP cartridge, though later versions would also be produced in the more powerful 9mm. But its most distinctive feature was its integral suppressor, which formed the entire front section of the weapon. The Welrod measured just over 12 inches in length for the Mark II pistol version and just over 14 inches for the Mark I carbine version with a shoulder stock. It consisted of a cylindrical tube approximately 1¼ inches in diameter, inside which were housed both the suppressor baffles and the barrel, The grip was positioned near the rear with a simple trigger mechanism. At the very rear was the bolt, which the user rotated and pulled back to load each round, then pushed forward and rotated to lock before firing. There was no magazine in the conventional sense. The Welrod held 6 rounds in a fixed internal magazine in the grip, each of which had to be chambered manually. The entire weapon weighed just over 2 pounds when loaded. The appearance of the Welrod was deliberately utilitarian and unremarkable. It looked exactly like what agents often claimed it was when carrying it concealed, a section of pipe, perhaps a part for a bicycle pump or a mechanical component. There were no external features that immediately identified it as a weapon. The suppressor section was smooth and cylindrical. The grip was simple and functional. There were no sights beyond a simple V-notch and post arrangement that could barely be seen. Everything about the design emphasized concealment and silence over accuracy or rapid fire. This was not a weapon for sustained combat or engagement at any significant range. It was a weapon for one specific purpose: killing a single target at close range, silently, and then disappearing. The technical innovation that made the Welrod so effective lay in its suppressor design, which was remarkably sophisticated for its era. The integral suppressor took up approximately 7 inches of the weapon's length and contained a series of baffles, rubber wipes, and expansion chambers that worked together to trap and cool the propellant gases. When the weapon was fired, the expanding gases from the cartridge were forced through a series of metal discs with small holes, each baffle reducing the pressure and velocity of the gases. After passing through the baffles, the gases encountered rubber wipes, flexible discs with small holes through which the bullet passed. These wipes sealed around the bullet and then closed behind it, further containing the gases. The entire system allowed the gases to expand and cool gradually rather than exploding outward as in a conventional firearm. The result was a dramatic reduction in the report of the weapon. But suppressing the muzzle blast was only part of achieving silence. The Welrod's designers addressed every possible source of noise. The weapon was deliberately chambered for subsonic ammunition, cartridges loaded with reduced powder charges that kept the bullet below the speed of sound. This eliminated the supersonic crack that occurs when a bullet breaks the sound barrier, a noise that cannot be suppressed by any muzzle device. The bolt-action mechanism meant there was no noise from a cycling action, no clatter of a slide or working parts moving rapidly back and forth. The user manually operated the bolt before each shot, a slow and quiet process. Even the trigger mechanism was designed to be as silent as possible, with smooth operation that produced minimal mechanical noise. Every aspect of the weapon's design worked toward the single goal of eliminating sound. The result was extraordinary. When fired, the Welrod produced a sound variously described as a soft cough, a dull thump, or a noise like someone slapping a book closed. Measurements taken by modern researchers suggest the Welrod firing subsonic 32 ACP ammunition produced approximately 73 decibels, roughly equivalent to the sound of a door closing firmly or hands clapping once. This was dramatically quieter than a suppressed conventional pistol, which typically produces around 100 to 110 decibels, and infinitely quieter than an unsuppressed weapon, which produces around 150 to 160 decibels. At distances beyond a few yards, especially with any ambient noise such as traffic, conversation, or wind, the Welrod was effectively silent to observers who did not have direct line of sight to the shooter. This was precisely what SOE had requested, a weapon that could be used in occupied territory without immediately alerting enemy forces. Training agents to use the Welrod required emphasizing its unique characteristics and limitations. Unlike conventional pistols designed for rapid fire and engagement at distance, the Welrod was explicitly an assassination weapon, intended for use at close range against a single target. The effective range was typically stated as under 20 yards, though in practice it was most often used at distances of just a few feet. The lack of conventional sights and the crude trigger pull meant accuracy beyond close range was poor. The single-shot nature of the weapon meant there was no possibility of rapid follow-up shots. If the first shot did not incapacitate the target, the agent would need to manually cycle the bolt before firing again, a process that took several seconds and required both hands. Agents were taught to approach targets from behind when possible, to fire at the head or upper chest at point-blank range, and to ensure the target was down before attempting to escape. The Welrod was issued primarily to SOE agents operating in occupied Europe, to SAS and commando units conducting raids behind enemy lines, and to resistance fighters through clandestine supply drops and smuggling operations. It was never a weapon produced in large quantities. Estimates suggest between 14,000 and 15,000 were manufactured during the war. Each weapon was treated as highly classified equipment. Agents carrying Welrods were under strict orders to destroy the weapon, rather than allow it to be captured, as its existence and design were closely guarded secrets. The fear was that if the Germans obtained examples and understood how it worked, they could develop countermeasures or replicate the design for their own use. SOE went to considerable lengths to keep the Welrod's existence secret, even from other Allied organisations. The operational use of the Welrod remains largely classified and shrouded in secrecy even today. Many of the missions where it was employed have never been fully declassified, and the agents who carried it rarely spoke publicly about their work. But fragmentary records and post-war accounts provide glimpses of how this unusual weapon was used in the shadows of occupied Europe. Resistance networks used Welrods to eliminate collaborators and informers, individuals whose betrayals had led to the capture and death of resistance members. The silent nature of the weapon allowed these assassinations to occur without triggering immediate German reprisals against the broader population. SOE agents used Welrods to eliminate sentries during raids on infrastructure targets, allowing sabotage teams to approach their objectives undetected. In several documented cases, Welrods were used to assassinate German intelligence officers whose expertise in counter-espionage made them particularly dangerous to Allied operations. One partially declassified operation involved an SOE agent in France, who used a Welrod to eliminate a Gestapo officer responsible for breaking up resistance networks in a particular region. The agent, whose identity remains protected, spent weeks establishing a cover identity and reconnaissance pattern around the target. The assassination took place on a street in a French city in the evening, with civilian foot traffic nearby. The agent approached the target from behind, fired a single shot to the base of the skull at a range of approximately 2 feet, and then walked calmly away. Witnesses present on the street reported seeing the target collapse, but no one reported hearing a gunshot. The confusion and the silent nature of the attack gave the agent crucial minutes to escape before German security forces responded. The Welrod had performed exactly as designed. Another documented use involved British commandos during a raid on Norwegian facilities. The commandos used Welrods to silently eliminate German sentries guarding an industrial target, allowing the main assault force to approach undetected and place demolition charges. The silence of the Welrod was critical to the success of the operation. Conventional suppressed weapons would likely have alerted other guards, compromising the mission. After the war, Norwegian resistance members confirmed that Welrods supplied by SOE had been used in numerous operations against German occupation forces, though specific details remain classified. The weapon also saw use outside Europe. Welrods were issued to Force 136, the SOE organisation operating in Southeast Asia against Japanese forces. British agents and resistance fighters in Burma, Malaya and elsewhere in the Pacific Theatre used Welrods for assassination and sentry elimination operations. The dense jungle environment of the region, with its high ambient noise levels from insects, birds and weather, provided ideal conditions for the Welrod's silent operation. Japanese occupation officials and collaborators were eliminated using these weapons, though again, detailed records remained scarce due to the classified nature of the operations. The limitations of the Welrod were as significant as its capabilities. The weapon's effective life was limited by the rubber wipes in the suppressor, which degraded with each shot. After approximately 20 to 30 rounds, the wipes needed replacement to maintain optimal silence. The crude bolt action and lack of proper sights made accurate shooting difficult, especially under stress. The single-shot nature meant that if an assassination attempt failed, the agent was left holding a weapon that required several seconds to reload while the target or nearby enemies could respond. The weapon was useless for any form of sustained combat or defensive use. An agent caught by German security forces while carrying a Welrod faced almost certain execution as a spy and assassin, as the weapon's design left no doubt about its purpose. Yet despite these limitations, the Welrod achieved a reputation among those who used it as highly effective for its intended purpose. Agents appreciated its reliability. The simple bolt action and robust construction meant the weapon rarely malfunctioned, an essential quality for equipment that might be buried in a field for weeks before use. The silence was genuinely remarkable, exceeding the expectations even of those who understood the theoretical principles. The weapon's concealability allowed agents to carry it in situations where any conventional firearm would have been impossible to hide. And psychologically, the Welrod provided agents with a tool that gave them agency and offensive capability in environments where they were otherwise nearly helpless against the overwhelming power of the Nazi security apparatus. The Germans, despite their sophisticated intelligence operations and their capture of numerous Allied agents, apparently never fully understood the Welrod during the war. While they certainly recovered examples from captured or killed agents, there is no evidence that they replicated the design or developed effective countermeasures. Post-war interrogation of German intelligence officers revealed that they were aware of British silent weapons but did not appreciate the sophistication of the Welrod's design or the extent of its deployment. This intelligence failure was a tribute to the security surrounding the weapon and the effectiveness of SOE's compartmentalization of information about its specialized equipment. After the war ended, the Welrod did not simply disappear into military museums. Its design had proven so effective that it remained in use with British special forces and intelligence services for decades. The weapon saw service during the Malayan Emergency, the conflicts in Aden and Kenya, and other Cold War operations where Britain's military and intelligence services required silent weapons. Welrods were still being issued to British Special Forces personnel as late as the 1980s, and possibly beyond, more than 40 years after the weapon's initial development. This extraordinary longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of the design and the continued need for weapons capable of truly silent operation. The technical principles pioneered in the Welrod influenced virtually all subsequent suppressor design. The combination of baffle stacks, expansion chambers, and wipes became standard in suppressor engineering. The recognition that achieving genuine silence required addressing not just muzzle blast, but also ammunition velocity, action noise, and every other source of sound became fundamental to the design of modern suppressed weapons. Contemporary special operations forces around the world use suppressed firearms that are far more sophisticated than the Welrod, but they are based on principles that the Station 9 engineers established in that secret facility in Hertfordshire during the desperate years of the Second World War. The Welrod also influenced the culture and doctrine of special operations. It demonstrated that in certain types of warfare, silence and stealth were more valuable than firepower and rate of fire. It validated the concept that specialized equipment, designed for specific missions rather than general combat, could provide critical capabilities that conventional weapons could not match. The Welrod became a symbol of the kind of thinking that characterized organizations like SOE, and later Special Forces units: creative, unconventional, focused on effectiveness in specific scenarios rather than general-purpose utility. The weapon represented a philosophy as much as a piece of equipment. For historians studying clandestine operations during the Second World War, the Welrod represents one of the few aspects of that secret world that left tangible physical evidence. So much of SOE's work was deliberately designed to leave no trace, to be unattributable and deniable. Documents were destroyed, agents used false identities, and operations were structured so that even participants often did not know the full picture. But the Welrod was a physical object, thousands of which were manufactured and issued. Surviving examples in museums and collections provide concrete evidence of the reality of assassination operations that otherwise exist only in fragmentary records and carefully sanitized official histories. The weapon is a reminder that behind the heroic narratives of resistance and sabotage was a darker reality of targeted killings conducted by British agents and their allies. The ethics of assassination weapons like the Welrod have been debated since the war. The weapon was explicitly designed to kill individuals silently, often from behind, without warning or opportunity for surrender. This was not combat in any conventional sense, but premeditated killing, even if the targets were enemy soldiers, security personnel, or collaborators who had themselves committed atrocities. British military and political leaders justified the use of such weapons as necessary in the context of total war against a monstrous enemy, arguing that eliminating key individuals could save many lives and hasten Allied victory. Critics, even during the war, questioned whether such methods were appropriate for democratic nations that claimed to fight for civilized values. These ethical debates continue among historians and military ethicists today. What is indisputable is that the Welrod was effective at what it was designed to do. In the hands of trained agents and resistance fighters, it eliminated targets silently, allowing operations to continue without immediate compromise. It gave individuals operating under enormous disadvantages a tool that partially balanced the scales against the Nazi security apparatus. It contributed to the broader campaign of sabotage and resistance that forced Germany to divert resources to occupation duties that might otherwise have been deployed against Allied armies. And it did all this while remaining one of the best-kept secrets of the war, a testament to the effectiveness of British security procedures and the discipline of those who used it. Today, surviving Welrods are extremely rare and valuable. Most were destroyed after the war as part of the classified disposal of SOE equipment. Those that remain in museums are treated as significant historical artifacts, and many remain subject to security restrictions even 70 years after the war's end. When displayed, they draw fascinated attention from visitors who marvel at the weapon's crude appearance and sophisticated design, at the recognition that this simple-looking tube was one of the most effective assassination weapons ever created. Museum curators often struggle with how to present the Welrod, balancing historical education with the darker realities of what the weapon was used for and how it killed. The men and women who carried the Welrod into occupied Europe rarely spoke about their experiences, bound by official secrecy and often by personal trauma. Those who did leave accounts spoke of the weight of carrying a weapon designed explicitly for killing at close range, of the psychological burden of assassination operations, and of the fear of being caught with such obviously specialized equipment. They also spoke of the confidence the weapon provided, the knowledge that they possessed a tool that worked as promised, that gave them capability they would not otherwise have had. For agents operating behind enemy lines, often alone or with minimal support, the Welrod represented both power and terrible responsibility. The legacy of the Welrod extends beyond its direct influence on weapons design or special operations doctrine. It represents a particular moment in history when Britain, facing existential threat, mobilized its intellectual and industrial resources in creative and unconventional ways. The same nation that produced radar, the computer, and code-breaking machines also produced specialized weapons for silent killing, explosive devices disguised as animal droppings, and tools for every conceivable type of sabotage. This combination of technical sophistication and moral ambiguity in the service of survival against Nazi tyranny defines much of Britain's special operations legacy. The Welrod is perhaps the purest expression of that legacy, a weapon that was technically brilliant, practically effective, and morally complex. In the final analysis, the Welrod Mark II stands as one of the most significant small arms designs of the 20th century, not because of the numbers produced or the battles won, but because of what it represented about the nature of modern clandestine warfare. It was a weapon designed not for soldiers on a battlefield but for agents in shadows, not for honourable combat at distance but for silent killing at close range, not for general military use but for the specific and terrible requirements of assassination in occupied territory. It performed its dark purpose with remarkable effectiveness, remaining unsurpassed in its specific capabilities for decades after its creation. The Welrod reminds us that war is not only about armies and strategies, but also about individuals making difficult choices in desperate circumstances, using whatever tools are available to resist tyranny and oppression. That some of those tools were designed specifically for silent killing does not diminish the courage of those who carried them, or the justice of the cause they served, but it does complicate the narrative and remind us that victory in total war required methods that remain morally uncomfortable even in retrospect. The silent killer from Station 9, the weapon that looked like a pipe and killed like a whisper, remains one of the most fascinating and troubling artifacts of the Second World War, a testament to human ingenuity applied to the grim necessities of secret warfare.